For this set of notes, we're going to be looking at the anatomy, which is the actual structures, and the physiology, which is the function of those structures on a neuron cell. So we'll start by just labeling a neuron cell so you can see what those structures are and where they're located. And then we will go into the functions of each of those structures and what role they play as a part of the neuron. So let's go ahead and get started. So here's our neuron. This is just a kind of basic drawing of one, but it should allow us to label the structures. So you're going to want to try and recreate this drawing the best you can on your notebook. Make sure you leave room above and below for labels. So the first thing that we're going to label here are the dendrites, which I've drawn in green. So everything in green is a dendrite. And we'll talk about what those do in just a second. The dendrites are connected to the cell body, which is also called the soma. So in a nerve cell, the cell body is called a soma. And I should add, a neuron is a nerve cell. Coming off of the cell body, we have this white axon. And those axons end, these are all the same, in an axon terminal. Terminate just means to end, so the terminal is the end of that axon. And the last thing here to label is this myelin sheath. That's what's shown here in yellow. This is the myelin sheath. So those are our labels for the nerve cell. If you need to pause it to get caught up, do so. I'm going to move on to the functions of each of those structures. So we'll start with the dendrites. Dendrites receive an incoming stimulus. That stimulus could be from outside the body, or it could be light. It could be touch when you're touching like your desk or a pencil. But they can also be a neurotransmitter. That might come from another neuron or another type of cell. So neurons can talk to other neurons with their neurotransmitters. So depending on the type and the function of that neuron, it might respond to a stimulus from outside the body, one of your senses, or it might respond to a neurotransmitter from another nerve cell. Next up, we have the cell body, or again, the soma. The cell body contains the nucleus and all other organelles. And it also allows for a stimulus threshold. And what this threshold means is there needs to be a certain strength of a stimulus in order for the nerve cell to respond. That cell body lets this kind of threshold build up, so beneath a certain strength of stimulus, the nerve cell won't do anything. But once that stimulus reaches, it will then fire that signal down the axon. So the cell body is also important for that stimulus threshold. Next is the axon. And as I just mentioned, the axon transmits an electrochemical, say what that means in just a second. The axon transmits an electrochemical signal from the soma, which is that cell body, to the axon terminal. And electrochemical just means that it is an actual electrical signal. It has charges and it acts just like electricity. But instead of that electricity just being formed by electrons like you might have in a telephone wire, for an electrochemical signal that comes from different ions. So in the case of a nerve, in an axon, we have sodium and potassium ions that are being moved back and forth. And that creates this gradient, this electrochemical gradient. So that's what it means. It's still electrical, but it comes from chemicals rather than just electrons. Next, for the function, is the myelin sheath. And that myelin sheath is a protective layer of fat and protein that surrounds an axon. And not all neurons have a myelin sheath. Only some do. But the neurons that do, those sheaths insulate the axon, which speeds up transmission. Nerve cells that have a myelin sheath on the axon can send their signals much faster than a nerve cell that does not have a myelin sheath. And there's two different types of cells that can provide the myelin sheath. One is a Schwann cell. It's also called a neurolimocyte. And the other is oligodendrocytes. So there's two different cells that can make myelin sheaths. And then last up for function is the axon terminal. And the axon terminal releases neurotransmitters when it receives that electrochemical signal. So in the electrochemical signal that starts in the cell body and then moves down the axon, when it reaches the axon terminal, a neurotransmitter is released, and that neurotransmitter acts on the target cells. And depending on the function of that nerve cell, it will depend on what the target cell is. You know, if it's a rod or a cone, which are specialized neurons, then the target cell is going to be a nerve that goes through your eye, the optic nerve, to your brain to be understood and to convert that signal into an actual image in the brain. If it's a nerve cell in your finger that detects touch, then it's going to immediately connect to another nerve in your spinal column. So depending on what the purpose of that nerve cell is the different target. Motor nerves in your body will connect to a muscle and cause a muscle to contract. So there can be different target cells, but whatever the neurotransmitter is will act on its specific target cell. That's going to do it for our notes on the anatomy and physiology of a nerve cell. Thanks for watching. Make sure you reach out if you have any questions.